Welcome back. I hope you've all enjoyed the short break that you had to refresh yourself. We'll now move on with our technical sessions and panel discussions. Now, in this session, we will be evaluating the drivers and regulations surrounding gasification. Coal to gas technology has been around for nearly 100 years and it has been refined over the years. Yet, in a country which depends on imports to meet 85% of its oil needs, there are very few coal gasification plants which are running now. Now, gasification performance is dependent on the coal type and the gasifier configuration. The choice of gasification technology is dependent on a variety of factors, but coal type is generally the least flexible factor. How can existing gasification technology be tweaked to convert high ash Indian coal into syngas? Can this be done in a financially efficient way? What are the important factors driving the gasification ecosystem that regulations defining the standards for the industry? Please welcome our speakers who will be discussing this topic. We are happy to welcome Bob Carter, Group Vice President, Large Project Business Development, and he's, of course, with us at this point in time. And we also want to welcome Mr. Ajay Shankar, Distinguished Fellow of TEDI, who will be joining us to speak on this topic as well. Bob, I'll hand it over to you. Please start with your presentation and yours.
Thank you, Anisha. Let me go ahead and let me share a group of slides here just to help facilitate the dialogue. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Please go ahead, Bob.
Okay, terrific. Okay, industry leaders, distinguished colleagues, I'd like to begin today by thanking the Mission Energy Foundation for putting on this event. It's events like these, I think, that give us the opportunity to really show what gasification can do and where it fits into the energy transition. And we do think it's, particularly relevant here in India. And we'll talk about, and I'll go over a few of the drivers and how we see it fitting into India's energy transition. So as many of you know, I'm sure, coal has been one of the key drivers for many countries in terms of their economy's growth and development as they've, developed over the last 150 years. And this is no different for India. India currently gets over 50% of its energy from coal. They consume over 900 million tons of coal, putting it up among the leading coal consumers, in the world. And again, have proven reserves that can last well over a century. And so again, the potential to utilize this feedstock certainly is there, for the foreseeable future. But obviously, we're facing many challenges with coal. The primary application for coal today is in thermal power plants, and we're starting to see obviously a slowing of growth in those in the consumption of coal for that purpose. And we've even seen a decline in the recent last couple of years. And we see the challenges that this faces, being a couple major challenges. First, there's competition from lower cost renewable power. As wind and solar have become cheaper and come down the cost curve over the last couple of decades, India's renewable power segment is growing quite quickly as a viable alternative. There's still challenges with renewable power, but we're seeing it compete for a portion of the energy mix within India. There are challenges around some of the pollutants that come out of thermal power plants. SOx, NOx. There are high levels that come out of a thermal process. There are ways to abate that, but they're expensive and don't necessarily get us to the ideal case, really, of no SOx and NOx emissions. But probably the most talked about challenge, with thermal power is CO2 emissions. And I think we've seen this, over the last 2 years in particular. The global community, the energy in the global community has picked up significantly in terms of their concern over coal as a sustainable use of energy. Coal emits a significant amount of CO2 relative to the amount of energy that it produces. And so it's a big challenge. And I think coming out of COP26, you can see the demand for clean, sustainable energy being, on the forefront of a number of policymakers' minds. And, when we look at thermal power plants, one of the challenges, is even solutions like capturing CO2 out of the flue gas is a challenge because it comes off at a relatively low concentration. It's, it has other pollutants in that flue gas. And we don't think at Air Products, we don't think it's really an economically feasible solution to capture that CO2, clean it up, and then sequester it from a thermal power process. However, we do think there's a path forward for coal that is more sustainable. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to maybe spend just a little bit of time on what we see the future state of energy, globally. And we do think it's all going to start with renewable energy. So solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, bio is going to produce electricity. And we see it being directly used for direct applications, like light transport and electric vehicles, heating, cooling, light industry. That electricity as a direct use really isn't going to be a solution when we look at heavy industry like steel, chemicals. When we look at some of the heavy transport like ships, planes, trains, heavy batteries, and solutions like that really aren't going to work. And so we're going to see people taking that renewable energy through electrolysis to green hydrogen. And we think green hydrogen is going to be the solution for this segment of supplying this segment of the energy balance. And I think we've seen, even in India, we've seen Prime Minister Modi talk about green hydrogen and again, in the role that it will play. But there are challenges with this picture. We can't get to this state today. When we look at renewable energy, getting to 24/7 electrical power is very expensive. And when you do it on a very large scale, like for the national grid of a country, and you're looking at, batteries, or you're looking at pumped hydro, it's really not feasible on that large scale. Those storage options become infeasible due to, the number of batteries, the materials that make up those batteries, like lithium. They just don't exist in the quantities that are needed to store energy at that scale. When you look at things like pumped hydro, the volume of water to store the energy of a country like India, it's a significant volume of water when you do the math behind it. It can be feasible at a smaller scale, but not at a large scale. And then electrolysis. When we look at green hydrogen, it's very expensive today. I mean, Air Products knows this firsthand. We believe this is the future. We're investing in the world's largest green hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia. It's over $5 billion. We're taking 4 gigawatts of power, renewable power, to green hydrogen. But the challenge is the entire segment of the market is not ready for or cannot handle green hydrogen from an economic standpoint. The policies aren't in place to support that widespread adoption. The cost for green hydrogen has a long way to come down the curve as new technologies around electrolysis are being developed. The manufacturing of electrolyzers has not hit scale yet. And so it's going to be a long time before we see this picture that I have on the screen today develop. And I think you're going to see this will play out over decades in some countries, a couple of decades. In some cases, it'll be several decades. And so we think it will take, between, 20 years, 30 years in some countries to as many as 50 years in other countries to adopt this picture. And so there will be a long transition. And this is where we think gasification can play a role. And so again, we think gasification, as I mentioned, can help bridge the gap between, the ideal state of, clean, sustainable energy and where we are today with thermal power production. Again, because there's several advantages to gasification over thermal power production. One, in kind of right off the bat, it significantly reduces SOx and NOx emissions. It effectively eliminates these emissions and makes these pollutants, will not appear over the skyline coming out of these plants. These things like the sulfur is effectively, turned into elemental sulfur, either in a solid form or a molten form. And again, we keep that from getting into the air, through the process. It's quite easy to do. and is part of the gasification process today. The second thing is around CO2 capture. These plants, it's quite easy to capture the CO2 off a gasification process. It actually, today, the crude syngas that comes off of the gasifiers goes through an acid gas removal plant. And this takes out the CO2 as well as the hydrogen sulfides. And that CO2 comes off in very high concentrations. And when the policies and the regulations are there, and assuming the local geology enables sequestration, it is possible to come after 5, 10, 15 years after these projects are built and retrofit those facilities to capture that carbon quite cost effectively and sequester that in the ground. The third thing, when we look at gasification, it also opens up a number of new opportunities for India. India is currently using coal and monetizing coal strictly for power. Through going through gasification, the opportunity to reduce the reliance on imported methanol, ammonia, DME that could be used to replace as an LPG replacement, and several other imported feedstocks is there, where you can produce those products domestically, utilizing your domestic resources, as well as encouraging additional foreign investment to come in on those projects. In the last point, which I think is also very important, is we recognize these projects have to be economical, right? Fundamentally, doing projects that need large subsidies and whatnot, we understand is not feasible at a large scale. So they have to be done economical. But the way that's done, we have to be very careful with the technology to make sure the projects are designed in an economical fashion. So what this means is when we look at these projects, they have to be world scale projects. So done at the largest scale to get down to the lowest cost per unit that we can achieve. We have to select the right products we're producing and the right supply chains to the end markets to make sure that they're feasible. But this can be a feasible technology when all those factors are optimized, to compete against imported products. One of the other large benefits of gasification, and I think this is particularly relevant today, is there's a significant amount of volatility in some of these commodities that we're talking about producing. So if you look at today, if you look at LPG, if you look at natural gas, if you look at ammonia, methanol, the prices are quite volatile today and actually have gone up, substantially, 100%, 150, 200% from where they have historically stood at. And so there's a lot of volatility in that market. Gasification actually provides the opportunity to really significantly reduce that volatility. Because such a large percentage of the cost to produce the products is capital and it's operating costs that are fixed over time. And in the piece that does vary is coal is substantially smaller. You're not going to see the same type of price volatility that you would see with some of those other imported products. So again, we think these are the primary drivers. As the host mentioned today, there are some challenges with gasifying coal in India. India is known for, they have a lot of coal, but a lot of that coal is high ash, 40% plus ash. Air Products, we do have two of the leading technologies in gasifying coal, our slurry feed technology and our dry feed technology. And our dry feed technology, it was formerly the Shell technology, can gasify high ash coals. And so, for instance, if you have 40% plus ash, this would be the technology that we would be recommending to use. This is the technology that's being used on the Tauscher project, which again is gasifying high ash coal. If you look at the right-hand side of your page, the top two projects in Luan, China, and Bumi, Indonesia, are two projects that Air Products is doing. They're coal gasification projects. We also have a couple other projects that are not on the screen, but these are two of the larger projects that are underway. In Luan, this plant came on stream about 2 to 3 years ago, gasifying coal that's being used. The syngas is being taken through a Fischer-Tropsch process in China. In the case in Bumi, Indonesia, we've announced a world scale coal to methanol project where we're gasifying high ash coal. So this again is 40% plus coal. This project is in execution, and we expect it to come online in the 2024-2025 timeframe. And again, but this is the process that's being used there would be very similar to a lot of the conditions in India, given the types of coal that are in India. They could be feasible. But again, just another example of where that's being done. The plant on the bottom is not a coal gasification project. This is a vacuum resid gasification project in Saudi Arabia using our resid gasification technology. And it's really just to demonstrate the scale of what some of these projects can be. This is a $12 billion project, and Air Products just recently acquired this project from Saudi Aramco with our partners Aqua Power and Saudi Aramco. And just gives you an idea of the scale of how big the projects can be and how big some of the investments can be. So in summary, Air Products believes that, coal, there is a role for coal in coal gasification in this energy transition. We think the application of thermal use of coal will decline over the next decade, and we think that that trend will continue. But we think gasification is a technology that can be used to help bridge the gap until we get to that green hydrogen state in truly renewable state in a more sustainable fashion, help bridge us through the next couple of decades, while accomplishing a lot of other objectives which we think are important for India. Again, reducing reliance on foreign imports, utilizing the existing coal reserves, and attracting foreign investment. So I'd like to thank you, and I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carter, for your address. Very enlightening. I think everybody in the audience here would like to discuss the India-specific conditions when it comes to gasification. And if you have any questions that you would like Mr. Carter to answer, take this opportunity, type it in the Q&A section, raise your hands. You will get the chance to ask this question directly from Mr. Carter. Now, I would request Mr. Ajay Shankar, Distinguished Fellow Terry, to please address the audience. Mr. Shankar, you're on mute. I request you to please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you. I must begin by complimenting Bob for an outstanding presentation. And I'm really impressed by his understanding of the Indian situation in the Indian context. So I would like to begin by picking up and developing some of the key points that he made in his presentation. And I think that should drive our thinking in India. So the most important point which emerges from his presentation is that till we get to the stage of a commercially viable green hydrogen economy, which who knows, it could be 10 years or 40, 50 years, or it would vary across countries. Coal gasification is an important transition technology which has great potential. Now, if you look at the transition from India's point of view, our Prime Minister has announced net zero by 2070. So that's a long enough period for commercially viable investments to take place and to recover, to give returns to investors and to benefit the economy. The other major point which he made, and again that is very important, is that at the end of the day, economics should drive decisions and do drive decisions in the market. And given India's situation today, government may not be in a position to provide fiscal incentives or finances on any significant scale for this route. But it turns out that it may be making economic sense for a number of uses which have been mentioned by Bob. And I think the key point which he made again, which I'd like to certainly emphasize, is that if we want the best economic economics for an investment decision, then it has to be on scale. It has to be on a global scale and with the globally, best competitive technology and equipment. So that is something which is important for us in India because we shy away from investments on a large scale for global scale facility because we're not too sure or confident. So I think those in India who would look at this and would want to invest here, whether they're private companies or government companies, must look at the globally best plant of the optimal scale and look at the economics very carefully and then take investment decisions. Uh, the fact that India has coal and the coal is cheap and would remain cheap in the foreseeable future is something which I think we need to take full advantage of. Sometimes we tend to lose sight of that. And sometimes the rest of the world unfairly says that we subsidize fossil fuels. We don't. In fact, we have the highest rates of taxation on fossil fuels, and effectively we don't call it a carbon tax, but if we were to call it a carbon tax, it would be one of the highest in the world. And coming to the point that this is potentially a very important transition fuel or transition route for our industrial processes, is the key driver for the use of this technology in the coming years or the decade. Because in the industrial sector, India has yet to build up the enormous capacities that it needs. So whether it is steel, whether it is petrochemicals, or whether it is fertilizers, India is still at an early stage of the build-up of the capacities it needs to create to meet its domestic needs. So this is a good inflection point for investors in India to look at this technology very carefully and see that it where it fits in a commercially viable way, taking a slightly longer term view. Now, if it also leads to cost savings of a certain kind, then there are systems within India where or if it leads to greater energy efficiency, then there are regulatory frameworks which encourage uh, higher levels of energy efficiency or economic efficiency. So I think those who would like to move in this direction need to figure out what enabling drivers they should ask government to provide for for a speedier use of what would appear to be a viable technology. And now I'm referring to enabling drivers from within government because the key is that within our regulatory system, coal is a highly regulated sector in India. And so, what are the changes in terms of allocation of coal mines or using coal mines or coal stocks for this kind of purpose, or permitting existing steel producers to use that coal for the coal that they have got allocated as a captive mine for this process and look at the economics of it? And are there some modest tax breaks or incentives that could be considered by government? Because I think Bob brought it out very clearly that the investments have to be based on market considerations and on commercial viability. And in India, given the enormous fiscal constraints with government, I think it's not very realistic for anybody to expect very large scale financial support from government for many of these investment decisions. Though the tendency is to try and see if we can seek some benefits, and sometimes we do succeed. But I have a view that if any program takes off on the basis of government subsidies, then it ends up being constrained by the quantum of subsidy that is available or likely to be available. So it is much better for technological transitions to take place on the strength of commercial viability and for investors and users to look at change within that prism. I'd like to end here and look forward to answering some questions or listening to the question and answer session. But I would compliment the organizers that they've chosen the right time for discussing this, because I think we are at a bit of an inflection point as far as this technology is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shankar, for your address. Now, we've got a few questions that have come in. And one question has come from Sandil Nayak from JSPL. So his question is to you, Mr. Carter. He's saying, we have reached a peak time where we need to limit the emissions of CO2. So the world is moving towards renewable energy sources. But it's a dilemma that we don't have enough alternative technologies against fossils. Would you like to dwell on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that again, our company, believes, and I believe that, we absolutely are moving towards renewables, and that is the future. I think there's no denying that. I think it's, it's an imperative that we all have, to move in that direction, and our company is moving in that direction. I think that the challenge is trying to convert, to that state in a very short period of time is just really not feasible. It's not economically feasible, as some of the costs are quite high. And then technically as well, it's going to take a little bit of time, I think, to be able to get to some of the cost points that we need to be at to make it attractive to be there. And I think gasification can help solve some of the problems. I think, as we mentioned, CO2 emissions, it is a problem. There's no question about that. And we need to limit and control that as much as possible. And gasification does produce less CO2 emissions than thermal, power consumptions modestly. It's just modestly a modest reduction. However, there is the option and the opportunity to capture that carbon at a later point if policy develops and the geology is there. And so we do think, because you can capture it at very high concentrations off of the process, you can do it relatively economically compared to a lot of other alternatives like capturing off of flue gas. And so we do think that it is it's one of the solutions. Obviously, there's many different components of the energy mix to get to kind of navigate this energy transition. But we do think gasification plays a role.
Well, I would like to come in with a comment also,
Please.
which is that globally people are looking at shifting from the use of coal in steel making to gas, and then looking at getting hydrogen in as the gas, because there is a learning process involved. So the ultimate solution is green hydrogen, before that hydrogen, which is not green, and before that gases in lieu of coal. I mean, that's my understanding of the global thinking on taking steel making to a net zero situation, because steel making, like some other sectors, are very hard to abate sectors in terms of current understanding of technology, current level of production using these new technologies, as well as the costs. So some pilot projects are being attempted globally in this direction, and I think Indian steel industry could try and leapfrog and be in the global frontier, and then see how government could, support that transition
This is
in a way which is feasible.
this is actually an excellent point. So Ajay, that's an excellent point that you're making. That when you look at gasification, one of the things, for instance, it can play a role is providing hydrogen as an example to steel making. So they convert over their processes from a blast furnace process to maybe a DRI process, for instance. It enables that conversion where they can use a relatively low cost form of hydrogen. Even though it may be gray hydrogen, it may enable that transition. So when the cost of green hydrogen comes down the curve, now the uses and the consumers of that green hydrogen are already in place and available, and to enable that, again, that transition to take place.
Right. We have another question, which Mr. Venkatraman is asking, and this is for you as well, Mr. Carter. Why does the government why is the government looking at LSTK for methanol when you are bringing in BOO basis?
So LSTK, so in terms of a lump sum turnkey, and so I think this is for people who I think you may not be familiar with the acronyms. LSTK is effectively where the customer will execute the project themselves, or let's call it not execute the project, will own the project and have another company basically build the gasification project, gasification to methanol in this case project, and they will own and operate it. The customer will own and operate themselves. Versus BOO, which stands for Build, Own, Operate, where a third party like an Air Products will come in and build it, own it, operate it, finance it, and run that facility for the lifetime of that asset. So in terms of the trade-offs between the two, we see in the industry, we see different customers going in different directions. Air Products offers a licensing solution for people who want to go LSTK, and a BOO solution for customers that want someone to build, own, operate. Obviously, we feel very strongly that we have a strong value proposition for building, owning, and operating, the assets. From a government standpoint, it's difficult for me to comment on kind of incenting one or the other. It's really getting to what's the most economical solution, for that individual customer and that individual's customers' knowledge base in this areas and capabilities in this areas of whether or not they want to do this in-house or whether or not they want to outsource it to someone else.
Right. Mr. Carter, there are a few questions that you have already answered in the chat box. But for the benefit of the entire audience that may not have gone through this, can you just recap one of those questions, which is shell with high ash coal is with Syngas cooler or total Quench design?
Yes. So, when the gasification, when the syngas comes, the crude syngas, hot crude syngas comes off of the gasifier, there's two different technologies that we have to cool that syngas. We have a syngas cooler, and then we have a bottom quench technology. Both technologies can be applicable for high ash coal. So in the case of Tauscher, for instance, that project, we're using the syngas cooler technology. In the case of Indonesia that I mentioned earlier, we're using a bottom quench technology. And a lot comes down to the capital versus operating cost, the efficiency, I should say, of the syngas cooler is effectively more capital, but also more efficient. The bottom quench is a lower capital, but less efficient. So a lot comes down to how much additional capital versus the efficiency gains or losses in that optimization. And so again, that has to be done for each individual opportunity to determine really what's the most economical process. But both can be used.
Right. We have another question which was coming from Mr. Shakti Kumar Pandey. He's asking, is there any operating fast internally circulating fluidized bed gasifier working on a commercial basis?
So, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean there aren't some that exist. And so I'm not aware of any, but I'm not an expert certainly in that space. So that's probably a better question for others probably to answer. Sorry.
Right. Mr. Shankar, would you like to take that? Would you be aware if...
I don't think I can answer that. I don't think I can answer that.
All right. I think we have one question coming in from Mr. Venkatraman. I'm just adding him to the stage so that he can ask his questions directly to the speaker. He wants to ask the question. Mr. Venkatraman, you can turn on your video and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I heard this one for Bob Carter. So again, that we are looking at several methanol plants in India, including the one I have promoted in Neyveli, which is I promoted the 1 million tons of methanol per year based on what you are doing in Indonesia. So they went for a lower capacity, that to on LSTK. I am a member of the Niti Aayog, Niti Aayog planning
Yes.
commission. I'm sitting, not a member, I'm sorry, I'm the technical standing committee. And I've raised that issue because we want to see methanol is viable, because methanol price may be higher now because of the fact that the global carbon prices have gone up. But we
Yes.
have to be sure that we have economy of scale. Otherwise, we can't bring down the methanol cost. And if you go on a BOO basis, it's going to be all the more difficult because you are going to demand your methanol price, and that's
Right.
what you can give. So I'm talking loudly with you because you're going to be investing $10 billion in India. So you have to talk to these people and see how we can economically progress with the GOI, Government of India.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing up a good point that scale is extremely important in these projects. If you looked at building, for instance, a project at world scale, and so for methanol, what that means is something in the 1.7, 1.8, million tons a year is a world scale plant today. Versus say building something at maybe 30 or 40% of that scale. The cost per unit differential on methanol is in the 15 to 20% range, right? And so when you're looking at that, that can be on the order of $50 per ton, of your reinvestment price for that product to get to a reinvestment rate. So that's very substantial, on these products. So it's very important to get to scale on these projects to make them economical. Doing things at lower scale, the economics will be challenged.
Right. I hope that answers your question. And I would like to thank all our participants, speakers, for taking the time to join us in the Gasification in 2021 virtual conference. And I want to thank all who are asking questions. And I also want to thank our speakers for taking the time to answer all the questions that we've taken up so far. Thank you both for joining us today. We'll slip into a break at this point in time, an extended lunch break. Do use this opportunity to catch up with your peers and network with them. You can also visit the booths. So make sure you do visit the expo and come up to speed with all the offerings that are there. We'll wrap it up here and we'll see you again after lunch at 2 p.m. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.